If you're reading this in a cafe, AirPods, in munching on a croissant, then congratulations, you reliving in an absurdly luxurious era, one where nobody has to smash rocks just to survive winter. As for me, I just woke up in a pit that reeks of fur and damp moss, and the nearest croissant is probably about 40,000 years away. I'm not joking. It all started when I joined an archaeology team trekking through the Caucasus Mountains. They were digging sensibly. I was digging with ambition. They drank spring water. I drank Red Bull, while enthusiastically poking around in hopes of unearthing some ancient skull fragment that might earn me a few 100,000 likes. I stepped on a loose patch of earth, slipped in the most cartoonish whoops, fashion, and boom. I vanished from the civilized world with a scream that could soundtrack an entire Coldplay playlist. I didn't die, but I did wake up, buried in snow to the neck, surrounded by a silence so dense it could smother a thought. No drone buzz, no Wi-Fi bars, just a turkey-sized bird staring at me with an expression that screamed, "What species of idiot are you?" I managed to wiggle free, arms frozen, legs stiff. My face was still stamped with the firm slap of the ground. I swore, but I fell quiet the second I realized, I wasn't the only creature breathing mist into this ice age air. There, just past a bush, stood a figure, broad-shouldered, still as a statue. Watching, he didn't speak, didn't flinch, just stared, eyes small and glistening, brow massive, like it could house an entire paleoanthropology syllabus. A Neanderthal, an ancestor, a Homo neanderthalensis, and possibly the first being in history to look at me without judging my triple-layer Uniqlo puffer jacket. We locked eyes. I was shivering like a Bluetooth mouse with low battery. He tilted his head slightly, as if debating, eat now or freeze for later. In a panic, I reached into my backpack, the only thing that survived my fall, and pulled out a Snickers bar. May the gods of processed sugar be praised, because in that moment, nothing felt holier. I held it out. He blinked, stepped forward cautiously. His hand was the size of a snow shovel. He sniffed, took a bite, then another. His mouth curled into something, a smirk, a wince. Jury's still out. And then, without a word, he turned around and walked into the woods. But not all the way. He glanced back. That glance said, "Come along, you ridiculous thing." I had no real choice. And, to be honest, a small part of me was curious whether I was about to have dinner with my ancestor, or be dinner for him. I zipped up my jacket, took a breath, and followed. And somewhere in the back of my brain, a calm, documentary voice whispered, "Congratulations, you've just unlocked the one-way time travel package. No refunds." By the time I caught up with him, let's call him Greg, my legs had turned into two reluctant planks of frozen spaghetti. Greg, meanwhile, moved like a bear that had trained in ballet, massive, shaggy, but oddly graceful. He barely left footprints. I, on the other hand, sounded like a drunk elk stomping through a bubble wrap factory. The forest was quiet in that eerie, pre-language kind of way. No bird song, no wind, just snow falling in clumps, and the occasional crunch of a twig beneath my clumsy boots. The air smelled of wet bark, old fire, and the faint musk of something that eats raw meat for breakfast. Possibly Greg. We arrived at a sort of overhang, not quite a cave, not quite a house. Think Airbnb for Ice Age nomads. Minimalist, open concept, excellent ventilation. Inside were 5 other figures, huddled around a fire. One was gnawing on what I dearly hoped was deer. Another was poking at something in a makeshift pot made of ... Was that hide? And then they all looked at me. Have you ever been the only guy in a bar wearing neon bike shorts? Multiply that discomfort by a glacial era and you'll get close. Every pair of eyes in that cave zeroed in on me like I was a raccoon holding a Rubik's cube. Greg grunted. I interpreted it as, "Don't worry, he's not that dumb." No one responded. They just stared. I considered waving, decided against it. Instead, I slowly, carefully, took off my backpack and sat near the fire, close enough to feel its heat, far enough not to appear threatening. The universal body language of "I come in peace," and also, "Please don't clobber me." Greg sat. Someone passed him a chunk of meat, roughly the size of my forearm. He tore into it with the ease of someone born without molars. Then, astonishingly, he tore off a piece and handed it to me. Imagine being offered food by someone who may or may not have eaten his cousin last winter. You don't say no, obviously. You smile, you nod, and you pray it's not Greg Jr. I took the meat. It was warm, rubbery, and had a texture somewhere between overcooked liver and very determined tofu. The taste, smoky, wild, slightly gamey, but not unpleasant, like if venison and campfire ash had a baby. The others kept eating, occasionally glancing at me, but no longer with suspicion, more like curiosity. One of them, a woman with hair like a storm cloud and a jawline that could crack walnuts, reached into a pouch and tossed me ... something. A root, a tuber, a prehistoric potato. I bit into it. It tasted like defiance and dirt, delicious. There was no conversation, only fire crackling, bones snapping, and the sound of chewing, rhythmic, meditative, primal. No phones, no playlists, just mouths full and bellies slowly warming. And for the first time in a long while, I felt oddly human. Not swipe left, join the gym, reply to emails human. No, firelight in your face, meat in your hand. You dash and dash your dash pack, dash survived, dash another day human. Greg grunted again. I looked up. He was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite decode. Maybe he was thinking, "You chew weird." Or maybe, just maybe, he was saying, "Welcome to dinner, cousin." I woke up in the middle of the night because of breathing. Not mine, though I was wheezing like a tired donkey after dreaming of being chased by a mammoth stampede. No, this was a different kind of breath. Deep, slow, heavy. Like someone nearby had lungs the size of a wine barrel. I blinked and remembered I was still in the cave, still wrapped in a hide blanket that smelled like fat, wet fur, and possibly regret. Or the menu. Around me, the other Neanderthals were asleep. A small fire still flickered, casting orange shadows against the stone walls. They slept like boulders, still, grounded, as if every nap was practice for the great sleep that comes with death. I couldn't go back to sleep, but clearly someone forgot to tell them. They were still breathing right next to me, fogging up the ice age with slow, deliberate exhales. I sat up, hands shivering over the fire. Then, a movement behind me, soft as mist. I turned. The woman with the chipped tooth was awake. She didn't speak, just walked over and handed me a small piece of hide, rough and warm like a prehistoric neck warmer. Then she sat beside the fire, stretched out her legs, picked up a small ember, and started working with a bone shard. She wasn't making a weapon, nor a tool. She was carving tiny lines, like Morse code for ghosts. Her hands were calloused but steady. Her eyes squinted in concentration. There was no rush, no hesitation. I watched her, mesmerized. Like every scratch in that bone was a thought, too fragile for speech. The fire crackled, my back slowly warmed. I stopped shivering. For a long moment, we just sat like that. Me, a misplaced idiot in thermal socks. Greg groaned in his sleep, shifting like a log in a stream. Just as my eyelids began to sag, she handed me the bone. I hesitated. Was I being given a relic, a souvenir, a test? She didn't explain, just nodded and laid down near the fire's dying glow. I looked at the bone. The carvings were rough, irregular, but deeply human, not made to be read, made to be remembered. I tucked it into the inner pocket of my coat, right next to my wildly beating heart. The next morning, the whole cave woke up at once. No alarms, no shouting. One of the men, built like a walk-in freezer, pulled me to my feet. Not gently, but not aggressively either. I was taken outside. The sky was blank. The fog was thick enough to chew. My nose went numb instantly, but the Neanderthals seemed unbothered. Bare arms, hides slung lazily over shoulders, feet crunching ice like it was morning cereal. I fiddled with my boots, marked with a strange scratch I couldn't decipher. Toy, tool, token. I slipped it into my pocket, next to the bone. We started walking. I didn't know where we were going. No one told me. No one pointed or gestured. I just followed, tried to keep pace, tried not to fall. But strangely, I felt calm. I didn't need a destination. I only needed the next step. Perhaps that was the wisdom of people who had never owned calendars or compasses. They just lived, one foot in front of the other, hoping to survive today so they could remember it tomorrow. It welcomed me with silence. The sound of breath, the crackle of fire, the tap of stone on bone, the language of presence. As sunset came, we stopped. Could be porcupine, might be squirrel. I didn't ask. Eating in silence felt like part of the sacred. That night, after the others slept, I lay on the cold earth, looking up. Stars blinked through the branches, cold, distant, eternal. But my chest felt warm, not from fire. That day, I was no longer an outsider. I was part of the pack. We went hunting. I don't know why. No one told me. No one gave a hand signal like, "Hey buddy, we're going to hunt. Wanna come?" They just stood up, grabbed sticks, grabbed stones, and walked straight into the forest like it was the most natural thing in the world, like brushing your teeth in the morning, except instead of minty freshness, it ends in blood. So I followed, partly because I was curious. Mostly because staying alone in a cave with a kid who likes chewing on bones did unseem like the safest survival strategy. Greg led the way. Still Greg, my ancestral friend, the bear-shaped man with shoulders like boulders and eyes that constantly flickered between soft golden retriever and possible apex predator. I shuffled behind him, my modern hiking boots making all the wrong noises in this ancient forest. Every step was a regret. Thorns tore my pants, mud swallowed my ankles, and the worst part, prehistoric mosquitoes. I swear they were the size of raisins and flew in organized squadrons like bomber planes. I kept swatting. Greg glanced at me like pathetic. After some time trudging through the underbrush, the group stopped. Greg froze. Not dramatically, just naturally, like a stone deciding it's done rolling. Everyone else froze too. I, in a desperate attempt to blend in, also froze. Then I saw it, an animal, about the size of a large dog, quick, alert, eyes glowing like tiny headlights, ears perked up like they were tuned to Forest FM. We were hunting something real, and I, quite honestly, wished someone back home was grilling a sandwich for me instead. Greg gently placed a stone on the ground. Not just any stone. This one had been shaped, sharpened, clearly designed for throwing with purpose. Another person slid through a bush silently like mist, and me, I stepped on a twig. Crack, like a gunshot at a yoga retreat. Everyone turned to stare at me. I attempted an innocent smile, but I probably looked more like someone mid-bow emergency. The animal ran off. Greg's eyes narrowed. An old man face-palmed, like he was questioning evolution itself. I grinned. No one grinned back. And yet, strangely, no one got mad. No one hit me. No one banished me from the tribe, or made me wear a shame leaf. They just quietly adjusted the plan. We moved deeper into the woods. I was beginning to understand. This wasn't trophy hunting. This wasn't for sport. This was survival. No meat, no life. One mistake, everyone pays. Way more intense than a TED Talk, and not a PowerPoint slide in sight. This time, Greg pointed me toward a rock. He placed a hand on my shoulder, heavy, steady, like the weight of all my ancestors pressing down through him. I got it. He was teaching me. I crouched behind the rock, scanning the undergrowth, took a deep breath, earthy, damp, tinged with something like fermented soy milk and dirt. Then I saw it, a hedgehog round, poking along under a bush. Greg looked at me. I looked at him. He raised an eyebrow. I picked up a stone. I threw it. I slipped. The stone went somewhere into the afterlife. I went face first into a pile of damp leaves, making a noise like a deflated accordion falling downstairs. The group stared at me. Then someone chuckled. Then another. And before I knew it, they were all laughing. Real belly laughs, like distant thunder. Loud, raw, but not cruel. Just, this guy is ridiculous, and it's kind of adorable. Greg laughed the hardest. He clapped my shoulder like I'd just failed a test, but somehow made everyone proud anyway. Then he walked up to the hedgehog, picked up my stone, and thunk. Hedgehog acquired. We gathered around the kiln. Greg started plucking the spines. Aggressively, efficiently. Fat popped, spines flew. I sat and watched. Not just learning how to prepare food, but learning how to fail with grace, how to be silent, how to laugh without pointing, how to make mistakes and still be fed. As dusk crept in, they made fire. No lighters, no flint. One guy started spinning a stick against a dry log. His face turned red, his hands trembled, but his eyes steady as a drum. When the first curl of smoke appeared, everyone let out a soft sigh, like a sacred ritual had been completed, like lighting a candle at a funeral, except the candle smelled like suffering and campfire. The hedgehog was placed on a hot rock. No skewers, no grill, just heat, time, and hope. The smell rose, rich, gamey, tinged with ash and victory. I sat there, arms wrapped around my knees, watching it roast, and thought, this is fine dining, not for the taste, for the meaning. The first piece went to the oldest man, then around the circle, one by one, no grabbing, no talking. When it came to me, Greg handed over a chunk. I bit in. It was burnt, oily, slightly crunchy. It was perfect. When the meal was over, they lay down around the fire. No tents, no snuggling, just dirt and sky. I lay beside Greg, head resting on a smooth rock. The sky above was black. No moon, no stars, just the sound of the forest breathing. I closed my eyes. This time, I wasn't afraid. I had hunted. I had laughed with ancestors. I was living among the extinct, and feeling less hopeless than ever. I woke up to someone brushing my hair. Let me clarify. It wasn't gentle. It felt like someone was trying to remove moss from a stone using a dry twig and no mercy. I opened one eye and saw her, the woman with the chipped tooth, the storm cloud hair, and the expression of a woman who's seen entire ice ages come and go and still doesn't have time for my nonsense. She was holding a rough comb, more like a carved stick with uneven notches, and attacking my scalp with a level of determination usually reserved for wars or sales on Black Friday. I sat up slowly. She didn't stop. She just adjusted her angle and kept going, like grooming was more important than consent. I considered protesting, but then she grunted something. Not a word. More like a vocal shrug, and I realized this was affection. I was being mothered by a Neanderthal, which, all things considered, is probably the most backhanded compliment the universe has ever given me. The others were already awake, moving around, packing up their meager belongings, which consisted mostly of rocks, bones, and pelts that smelled like the backside of winter. Breakfast was happening in the least Instagrammable way possible. A bit of cold meat, some mysterious tubers, and a handful of dirt casually wiped off before being eaten like nature's protein bar. The woman handed me a strip of dried meat, tough as leather, tasted like sadness and smoked elk, but I chewed anyway. Gratitude tastes better when you're not picky. Then she did something strange. She pulled a piece of sinew from her pouch, long, thin, and flexible, and began braiding it. Not her own hair, mine. I sat there, stunned, as she wove my unwashed, cave-scented hair into a lopsided, slightly pitiful braid. The others didn't even glance. Apparently, this was normal. Grooming the weird new cousin was just another Tuesday. When she finished, she gave me a little pat on the cheek. Not hard, just enough to say, "You'll do." Then she stood up and walked away. I sat there for a moment, stunned and slightly emotional, clutching my strip of mystery jerky and wondering how I, a fully grown adult from the 21st century, had just received a Neanderthal mom hug disguised as a light slap. Greg passed by, glanced at my braid, and gave me the tiniest, most dignified nod. "Reader," I nearly cried. We packed up and moved on. Today's route led us through a forest thicker than yesterday. The trees were gnarled, ancient, dripping with moss that smelled like whetstone and cold thyme. The light came in slivers, like the sky was trying to apologize for the weather. Birds flitted overhead, not colorful ones, just scrappy survivors with feathers the color of dust. I walked close to Greg. I don't know why. Maybe I felt safer. Maybe it was the braid. Maybe this is what happens when someone pets your head for the first time in 30,000 years. You bond. We crossed a narrow stream. I slipped. Greg caught me by the back of the coat like I was an untrained puppy about to bolt into traffic. He didn't say anything, just set me down and kept walking. Later, we stopped near a clearing. Greg crouched, pointed at some tracks in the mud. I leaned over. They looked like deer. Maybe, probably. Okay, fine. They were hooves, and I pretended to recognize them, like I had any idea what I was doing. Greg traced the prints with his finger, then looked at me, waited. I nodded solemnly. Yes, clearly a hoofed meat creature. He raised an eyebrow. I gave him a thumbs up. He sighed, a sound like glaciers groaning, and moved on. Around midday, we rested beneath an overhang. The fire was rekindled with practiced hands. I was still nursing my dignity when the woman, yes, her again, sat beside me and handed me a cup made from some kind of gourd. It smelled like boiled roots and regret. I drank it anyway. It burned going down, my sinuses cleared, my vision sharpened. I may have astral projected briefly. She watched me with mild amusement. Then, and I swear this is true, she reached into her pouch and handed me a tiny bone carving. It was of a four-legged creature with an enormous snout, possibly a pig, possibly a commentary on my posture. Either way, she gave it to me. I took it with both hands, nodded respectfully, and tried not to cry again. Later that evening, as the sky bled into purples and bruised blue, I sat by the fire, turning the little carving over in my hands. It was crude but careful, made with attention, like someone had remembered this shape, this animal, and decided it was worth immortalizing in bone. The woman sat across from me, stirring the pot. She didn't look up, but she said something, a low hum, almost a word, almost not. It sounded like the beginning of a lullaby that got lost in time. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't a tribe of grunting primitives. This was a family, messy, quiet, fierce, soft in odd places, like an old blanket that smells weird, but still warms you better than anything new. I was the alien here, the soft-handed tourist with no skills and bad balance. But I was being accepted, slowly, wordlessly, through food, fire, and forehead flicks, disguised as tenderness. I didn't belong, but they let me stay, and somehow that was enough. The morning began with a rock to the head. Not hard, just firm enough to wake me up and make me reconsider my life choices. The pebble bounced off my forehead with a small but disrespectful thunk. I opened my eyes to see her, the woman with the chipped tooth, holding a bunch of roots and staring at me like, "If you're alive, get up." I sat up slowly. My back ached like I'd been run over by a woolly mammoth playing hopscotch. I scratched my head. The lopsided braid she gave me was still there, a bit frayed, but intact, miraculous. Some part of me was beginning to believe this. Neanderthal woman was the original archetype of the tough-love grandmother. Greg was already by the fire, rotating a bone on a hot stone. Could be breakfast, could be a spiritual offering. With Neanderthals, it was often hard to tell. No one said much today. No grunts, no playful shoulder punches, not even the usual HMMPH of the old woman. The air felt still, heavy, like someone had announced that winter would now last forever. I nibbled on one of the roots, bitter as oversteeped tea, but invigorating. Greg looked at me, then pointed toward the sky. Low clouds, bitter wind, snow was coming, and I understood. Today was a moving day. They packed quickly. No suitcases, no backpacks. Each person carried only what they needed: a hide, a few tools, maybe a small pouch of things that didn't clink. Nobody looked back. No one snapped a farewell photo. All memories were packed into bones, hands, and steps. We left the cave and followed a path through the woods. Greg led, I was in the middle. The old woman brought up the rear, walking slow and steady, gripping her long staff like she was guiding not just us, but her ancestors, too. The hike wasn't far, but it was brutal. The cold cut through clothes like sarcasm through small talk. The trees stood silent. No birds, no animals, Just gray sky and frostbitten earth crunching beneath our feet. And that's when I noticed something. No one complained. No one groaned. "Are we there yet?" No one muttered, "My feet hurt." No dramatic sighs about the unfairness of existence. They just walked, breathed, walked again. Like stopping was the strange part, not the journey. Eventually, we reached a narrow pass between two cliffs, tall walls of stone rising on either side like ancient sentinels. Wind howled through the gap, cold and mournful, like a god whispering forgotten names. Greg stopped. The group stopped. Silently, everyone began collecting rocks. Even in the frost, hands moved quickly, stacking stones in a circle. I crouched down and joined. At first, out of imitation. But then I realized we were building a fire ring, a shelter of sorts. When it was done, they lit a fire. This time, it wasn't for food. It was for waiting. Waiting for what? I didn't know. But everyone sat around it, still and focused, like they were attending a funeral without a speech. The old woman sat beside me, pressed something into my hand, a stone etched with a crescent moon. I looked up to ask what it meant. She just shook her head. "Don't ask, just hold it." I slid it into my coat pocket, sat still. The sun dipped low. Snow began to fall, light at first, then steady. Greg stood, walked to the center of the fire ring, and did something that left me breathless. He knelt. This giant, kneeling head bowed. No command had been given, no signal, but one by one, the rest of the group knelt too. Even the red-haired child who usually side-eyed me like I was a bad joke with legs. I, the lone idiot still sitting, felt like someone who brought a sandwich to a moment of silence. I knelt too. Wind whipped at our backs. The fire crackled. No one cried. No one told a story. But I understood. They were remembering someone. Maybe someone who had died. Maybe a place they lost. Maybe something that had no name, only weight. I pressed my palm to the frozen ground. It bit at my skin. But inside, something was warm. A quiet heat, like being allowed to grieve with people who had no words for grief. When the sky went black, Greg stood. No one said a word. We rose and walked. I took the rear. My hand gripped the moonstone tightly in my coat, and I kept thinking, why me? Why had I, a clumsy outsider, been allowed to witness this? No answer came, just the sound of our footsteps echoing in the dark, a fading trail from a people who would soon vanish from history. But in my hand, the little stone was still warm, and I knew memories, once passed on, never truly disappear. We walked without speaking. By now, I was beginning to suspect that language, at least the way I understood it, might be wildly overrated. These people communicated in a kind of silence that wasn't awkward, wasn't empty, but rich. Modern humans might have called it uncomfortable, but in this tribe, silence had weight, layers. It was like living inside a wordless podcast, where every breath and glance was a sentence. I walked between Greg and the old woman with the chipped tooth. Greg strode forward like the cold didn't exist, like the ground wasn't frozen. I, meanwhile, shuffled along like a soggy biscuit, soft, unsteady, increasingly aware that my knees were on strike. Still, I didn't complain, partly out of pride, mostly because I'd started to understand something. As long as you're breathing, you keep walking. By midday, we reached a small valley, a sunken bowl between two slopes. It didn't look like much. A few broken logs, patches of snow, and a bunch of crows squabbling like teenagers, fighting over the last Wi-Fi signal. But the moment we arrived, the tribe broke into silent, purposeful action. Greg and 2 others disappeared into the trees, probably scouting. The old woman sat down and pulled a bone from her pouch, like it was both a tool and a relic. I, with survival instincts comparable to a loaf of white bread, decided not to be completely useless. So I started collecting sticks, honestly, just to feel like less of a walking hoodie. And then I saw tracks, fresh ones, not big, not deep, but clearly new. I made a quiet sound, halfway between a hey and a sneeze. A young man in the group, tan-skinned, squinty-eyed, like someone who had eavesdropped on every adult conversation since birth, walked over. I pointed at the tracks. He looked, then looked at me, and without saying a word, placed a hand on my shoulder. It was the Neanderthal equivalent of, "Not bad, kid." Greg returned shortly after, with good news, or at least news that led to action. There was an animal nearby, edible. The group began preparing, not with panic or hype, but with quiet precision. People checked weapons, tightened straps, adjusted spears. Someone handed me a stick, not sharp, not fancy, just heavy. I took it. My hands trembled a bit, not from fear of the hunt, but fear of screwing it up. I'd learned something. Here, no one had the luxury of carrying dead weight. Greg gave me a look, a nod. Then we moved. We crept through tall grass, steps soft and deliberate. I was placed at the back, rookie position, safest spot, best view. As we reached a ridge, I saw it. A deer, big, beautiful, eyes wide, ears alert, legs ready to bolt. It hadn't seen us yet. Greg raised his hand. Everyone froze. In that moment, I heard nothing but my heartbeat. Greg moved. The person beside him readied a stone. Arms tensed. A flick of the wrist. Thunk. A miss. Just swift, instinctual movement. One person rushed to block. Another lunged. Greg leaped onto a rock and hurled his stone with terrifying grace. This one hit. The deer stumbled. I stood frozen, clutching my stick, breathing like a marathon runner having an existential crisis. When it was over, they stood in a circle around the animal. No cheering, no high fives, just silent nods. One by one, they touched the animal. Then Greg stepped forward, knelt, and ended it swiftly, clean. No drama, just a gesture of respect. I watched, throat tight, not from the blood, but from the reverence, the way they treated this life, not as a prize, but as a gift. The old woman came over, handed me a flint knife. I got it. They were inviting me to help. No one said, "You're doing great." No one whispered, "This is your coming-of-age moment." But their eyes said it all. I cut, clumsily, slowly, but under the careful guidance of ancient, weathered hands. We wrapped the meat in hides, saved every part. A small portion was cooked on site. As the fire crackled, we sat around it, faces glowing orange, fingers greasy, eyes tired. No one rushed, no one wasted. I bit into my piece. It was warm, tender, slightly gamey, but the flavor wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that I wasn't watching from the edge anymore. That night, curled up in my hide next to the dying fire, I didn't think about my phone, or the news, or the world I'd fallen out of. I thought about Greg's second throw, about the old woman's hand on mine, and about the strange, quiet joy of finally belonging to something ancient, something you couldn't name, but could feel in your bones. We didn't return to the old cave. I didn't know if it was because winter had truly arrived, or if something had shifted after the hunt. But instead of retracing our steps, The group moved forward, farther, higher, into terrain I'd never seen before. Not on any map, not even in my imagination. The trees thinned out, the ground hardened. Snow blanketed everything like a giant white sheet trying to erase the planks. We walked through a world so blank, so silent. It felt like time itself had stepped away for a moment. The cold wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was a presence. It wrapped around my bones and whispered, "You're not built for this." I stuck close to Greg, gripping my walking stick so tightly I couldn't feel where my fingers ended and the wood began. Behind me, the old woman trudged on steadily, occasionally snapping off dry branches like she had all the time in the world and none of the fear. When we reached a low depression in the land, the group stopped. No one said anything, but I understood. We were looking for shelter. Greg pointed toward a large boulder nestled against a cliff. Some curled up. Greg got a fire going. The old woman struck flint against rock like she was calling an ancient spirit out of hibernation. I huddled into myself. The cold crawled down my collar, wrapped around my spine, slid into my gut. I shivered. Greg tossed me a fur hide. I wrapped it around my shoulders and nodded thanks, too cold to form words. That's when I realized something had changed. I wasn't embarrassed anymore. I wasn't ashamed of being slow, clumsy, or weak, because I had seen Greg stumble. The red-haired kid sniffled. The old woman moved slower than yesterday. The cold spared no one, but everyone kept walking anyway. When the fire caught, they passed out food, small pieces, carefully divided. No one asked for more. No one hoarded. Eating wasn't about fullness. It was about survival. That night, one of us didn't sleep. Me. Not because I was cold, but because the young man, the one with the squinty eyes, who had spotted tracks with me, was lying nearby, trembling. I looked closer. His forehead glistened with sweat. His lips were pale. His hands curled like he was trying to hold on to something slipping away. I looked at Greg. Greg met my eyes. Then he shook his head. There was no medicine, no doctors, no beds with rails and beeping machines. Just fire, just us. I shifted closer, put my hand on the young man's shoulder. His skin was ice, mine was warmer. Greg nodded. This time, it meant yes. So I sat beside him all night, holding his hand, leaning against the cold stone wall. I didn't cry, didn't think, didn't panic. I just stayed. When the sky started to pale, the shivering stopped. So did his breathing. No one screamed, no one wailed, but the silence grew thicker, heavier. Greg touched the boy's forehead, then stood. Others rose and started to prepare a new fire. The old woman sat beside the body and took out a small flint knife. She began carving something into a bone. I stayed where I was, my heart pounding in slow, dull thuds. An hour later, we carried him out. No coffin, no cloth, just a shallow hole dug in the frozen earth, scratched out with stones and hands. We laid him in it. No one said he was a good person. No one told stories about his youth. We placed stones over his body, one by one. Greg handed me a rock. I looked at it, then placed it on top, gently, like sealing a final word. And in that moment, I understood something. Death wasn't the terrifying part. Being forgotten was. Here, death wasn't dramatic. It wasn't ceremonial, but it was heavy, like a groove carved into bone. Not beautiful, but real. We stood in silence. The wind bit at our cheeks. The scent of snow, ash, cold meat, and wordless sorrow swirled around us. A scent I knew I would never forget, no matter how many years passed. Back in the shelter, I didn't look at Greg, but I knew, from that moment on, I was no longer a guest. I was a mourner, a memory keeper. Because they never truly disappeared. They just became the hands that quietly placed the last stone. The morning after the silent burial, the snow had stopped falling. Just a thin layer remained, barely ankle deep, soft enough to erase any trace of the night before, as if it had never happened. But we remembered. We didn't need pictures. We didn't need poems. Just the lingering chill on the rocks and a quiet hollowness no one spoke aloud. We set out early. No orders were given. It was as if each person heard the same summons, echoing from somewhere deep in their bones. I walked beside Greg, who was quieter than usual. His eyes weren't focused on the path ahead, but on something far beyond the mountains. For the first time in days, I asked a question. What was he to you? Greg looked at me, didn't speak. He just raised a hand to his chest and closed it into a fist. I understood. Not a relative, not a best friend. Something deeper, a fellow survivor, a fire sharer, a comrade in cold and hunger. Here, death wasn't about titles or closeness. Losing someone meant losing part of the memory that held the group together. That day, our trail led us downhill, along a frozen stream, slick as polished glass. I slipped at least 3 times. Greg didn't say a word, but each time I fell, he doubled back, grabbed my arm, pulled me up. Once, he handed me a sturdy branch, not as a weapon, but as a walking stick. I took it, nodded. That was thank you in their language. By midday, we reached a dip in the land, thick with dry, brambly bushes. The old woman decided to stop. Not a full camp, just a pause, to cook, to rest, and to tell stories. Yes, stories. For the first time since I arrived, night fell not only with silence and firelight, but with sound. We sat in a loose circle around the glowing coals. The red-haired child curled up next to the old woman. Greg was sharpening a flint blade. I was half dozing in my fur wrap when the old woman began to speak, or chant. Her voice was low, halting, rising and falling like breath on a cold mirror. I couldn't understand the words. Maybe it was myth, maybe memory, maybe both. But everyone listened, even Greg. I didn't need a translation. I knew this was a ritual, a preservation of memory. When she finished, no one clapped. No one said, "Wow, what a story." Just silence. And something deeper, the feeling that a tale had passed through you, not merely by you. Greg looked at me, pointed at the pouch on my hip, the one where I kept the crescent moonstone. I pulled it out. He nodded. Then, without a word, he stood and motioned for me to follow. I stumbled after him. We walked away from the fire, toward an old tree whose bark was slashed with claw marks, perhaps from a bear, or a wolf, or time itself. Greg handed me a piece of half-burnt charcoal, then gestured, "Mark the tree." I stared, then realized this was how they recorded things. Their version of a journal. A message to the future that we were here. I pressed my hand against the bark. It was cold, rough, scented with pine sap and smoke. I drew a circle. Inside it, I wasn't sure what to carve, so I drew a hand. My hand, Greg leaned in, took the charcoal from me, drew a symbol beside mine, a spiral, simple, clean, maybe his name, maybe his clan's mark. We stood in front of the tree together, neither speaking. The wind stirred, leaves rattled like dry bones. I stared at the charcoal lines, and, for the first time in my life, I felt undeniable. Not important, not immortal, just present. When we returned to the fire, the old woman was asleep. Others lay scattered around it, curled into prehistoric dumplings. Greg sat down. I sat next to him. We didn't say a word, but I knew, tonight, I left a mark. Not in history, in memory. And I, the awkward, time-traveling outsider, had begun to remember too. Not dates, not names, but feelings. That one night, I sat by a fire, and someone nodded as I carved my hand into the bark of a tree that I had been there, and someone would remember. The morning was wrapped in mist as we set off again. No one said, "Let's go." Greg simply stood, and the rest followed. As if everyone was tuned into some ancient frequency I was only just beginning to hear. Today, the silence was heavier, not mournful, just thoughtful, like the kind that fills a library or a temple. The kind that knows it carries something old. We moved along a ridge covered in moss and scattered stone, where the fog curled around us like soft, ghostly animals. The wind wasn't strong, but it was enough to make me hunch my shoulders by instinct. Greg led the way, his walking stick tapping a slow rhythm on the rocks. The red-haired child rode piggyback on the old woman, head slumped forward, dozing like a kitten in the sun. I was breathing carefully, not because I was tired, but because something was coming. It was the feeling you get when you know someone's watching you in the mirror, even though you're alone. And then we arrived. A closed valley, guarded by jagged cliffs that rose like the teeth of some ancient beast. In the center, a flat clearing dotted with old bones, old stones, and stone carvings. I stopped breathing for the first time on this journey. I felt I wasn't just traveling into the past, I was standing inside memory itself. The rock faces were covered in images, handprints, spirals, hunting scenes, crescent moons, stick figures, dancing, holding spears, walking hand in hand into what looked like, I swear, a mountain crack. There were no captions, no QR codes, but I understood this was their archive, their way of keeping what couldn't be said, only carved. Greg bowed his head in front of a large slab of rock. Then he pulled from his pouch a small bone, the one the old woman had carved during the night of mourning. He placed it into a crevice in the rock, gently, like setting a final stone on a cairn. A ritual completed. I looked around. The old woman sat quietly near one of the older carvings, her fingers tracing the cracked grooves, as if reading a very old chapter of a story only she still remembered. I suddenly felt smaller than I'd ever felt. Not weak, just translucent. This place wasn't for me, it was me, or at least what I came from. I approached one of the flatter rocks. My fingers brushed a spiral pattern, almost worn away. I wasn't touching art, I was touching presence. Someone had stood here, where I stood, and they had spoken with stone. I closed my eyes. In that moment, I heard something, not quite sound, maybe a memory, maybe someone else's breath caught in the rock. When I opened my eyes, Greg was standing beside me, offering a piece of charcoal. I hesitated, not because I didn't know what to draw, but because I didn't want to draw it wrong. I sat, and for the first time, I drew not to record, not to impress, not to be remembered. I drew because I needed to say something, in their way. I drew a figure lying down, with others holding hands around it. I drew a handprint, a crescent moon. I wrote nothing, but the marks were enough. When I looked up, the old woman was beside me. She hadn't made a sound, She just nodded. Farther away, Greg stood with his staff, watching the horizon where the sun had begun to slip behind the cliffs. A golden shaft of light pierced the gap in the rocks, illuminating the carvings. For a few seconds, they seemed alive, like they'd just been carved this morning, as if 1,000 years were looking right back at us. I took a deep breath, and I felt full. Not because the story was finished, but because I'd finally spoken in stone, and the stone had listened. We left the stone valley just as the sun was beginning to slip over the mountain ridge. No one looked back, no one bowed, but everyone moved a little slower than usual, as if each person was quietly packing something invisible to carry, a memory, a vow, or simply the echo of those carvings still burned into the backs of their eyes. Greg led the way, walking without his staff now. The old woman followed in the middle, her hand clutching the hollow bone, the one she'd carved the night of the funeral, now resting in the stone wall behind us. The red-haired child didn't fidget or complain. He walked silently, steps steady on the snow, like even he understood. Today wasn't a day for mischief. I brought up the rear. For the first time, I didn't feel like an outsider. Not because I'd become better, but because I'd stopped trying to be someone else. We descended through a narrow pass where the wind howled like a broken flute. We crossed a wooden bridge, barely more than a log, with ropes that only allowed one person at a time. Greg held out a hand to steady me. I didn't refuse. We both smiled, and for the first time, our laughter didn't break the silence. It joined it, like water running over stone. We paused at a stream, not wide, but clear enough to see the bottom. Greg washed his hands. The old woman dipped her cupped palms into the water, drinking slowly, like she was sipping the soul of the mountain. I followed her lead. The water was so cold it made my teeth ache, but it tasted pure. Not sweet, but alive. Then a sound came from the forest. Not a loud sound, just enough. Instantly, the group shifted. Not in panic, but like a ripple through still water. Everyone had a role. Everyone knew what to do. Greg signaled. The group spread out. I was in the center, clutching my stick like a shield, heart pounding in chaotic Morse code. From the trees, a shadow emerged. A man, not a beast, not prey, another human. He was tall, with a thick beard, and skin darkened by sun. He wore a different kind of fur, red-dyed hide, and his weapon looked more like a claw than a spear. He stared at us. Greg stepped forward. No growling, no shouting, just two men, two tribes, facing each other like two boulders about to collide or dissolve. They stared at each other for a long time. Then the stranger raised his hand. Greg raised his. They touched. No words, just touch. I didn't breathe. The stranger looked around, saw the child, saw the old woman, saw me. His gaze lingered on me just a moment longer than it needed to. Then he turned to Greg, said a few short words, not angry, not friendly. Greg nodded, and the man turned and walked back into the forest. Not rushed, not slow, just gone. We stood in silence for a while. Then people resumed washing their hands, as if the encounter was just a strong gust of wind. Strange, but expected. Greg turned to me, tapped his chest, then his head, then pointed to the path ahead. I understood. Some of us travel with feet, others with memory, with instinct, with the way they face the unexpected, not by reacting, but by receiving. That night, we stopped beneath a massive tree, its roots sprawling like the bones of the earth. The fire crackled. Greg handed me a thin piece of wood, a sign, a map. No, just wood. On it, there was a spiral carved, like the one I'd seen in the cave. Greg handed me his flint knife. His meaning was clear. Your turn. I looked at the wood, at the fire. Then I carved a line, not perfect, not symmetrical, but mine. Greg watched, smiled. Not the good job smile, the now you get it smile. I didn't know how many more days we'd travel, but I knew, starting now, I wasn't a visitor anymore. I was a firekeeper. It rained that morning, not a storm, just a quiet, persistent drizzle, like the earth whispering to itself. Each drop that landed on leaves tapped out a rhythm older than language, and for the first time in my life, I didn't find rain annoying. It felt necessary, as if the world were reminding us, I'm still breathing, and so are you. We found shelter under a jutting stone overhang, nestled against the mountainside. No one complained. No one sighed or muttered about getting wet. They just sat, each absorbed in a task so mundane it felt sacred. Greg trimmed the tip of his spear. The child scratched circles into the damp earth. The old woman pulled out an old fur and began mending a seam with a sliver of bone. And me, I sat and watched. Rain has a smell. It's not just wet. It's the musk of old ash, damp hide, moss, and something raw, earthy, the scent of time. It soaked into my clothes, my hair, even my bones. But I didn't mind. I felt part of it, as if, finally, I wasn't just observing the world. I was dissolving into it. Then, from the shadows of the rock hollow, the old woman crooked a finger at me. I crawled over. She held something small in her hand, a stone, smooth and flat, like the tongue of a forgotten god. Etched into its surface were shallow grooves, not deep carvings, but delicate scratches, like someone had brushed memory onto it instead of words. She placed it in my hand. I looked at Greg. He nodded. I turned back to her, silently asking, "What is this?" No answer. I had to feel it. I ran my fingers across the surface, once, twice, and something stirred. Not a sound, exactly, but the sensation of sound. A whisper without words, as if someone, long gone, had exhaled their soul into the stone, and it was still humming, faint but real. I held the stone to my chest, and I knew this wasn't valuable because it was rare. It was sacred because it held something, something collective, something ancestral, a piece of memory too big for one person to carry. That afternoon, the rain stopped. The sky remained gray, but no longer heavy. Greg walked slower, pausing often to study tracks. I followed. I'd learned to spot the difference between deer hooves, wolf prints, human footsteps, and the strange ones, the ones that didn't belong to anything I knew. We reached a stretch of forest where the trees grew close together, conspiring in whispers. Greg signaled a stop, not because of danger, but because this place was familiar. He led me to a tree stump, blackened by fire. On its side, a handprint. Next to it, a claw mark. I knew it instantly. He had been here before. Maybe it was his birthplace. Maybe a grave. Maybe both. I didn't ask. I just stood beside him. He pulled out a clean shard of white bone, not to bury, to carve. And for the first time, I watched Greg, silent, unshakable. Greg, sit, and etch something into that bone with the care of a man braiding a child's hair. It wasn't elaborate. It wasn't large, just a single line. But he carved it as if the world depended on it. Behind us, the old woman watched and nodded, as if she'd been waiting for this moment all along. I didn't know what he carved, but I knew what it meant. These markings weren't just memories, they were continuity, a way of saying, I am still here. Not with speech, but with scratches, with symbols, with presence. That night, we circled a small fire beneath a tree, with roots like ribs. There was no meat, only boiled roots and strips of dried hide, chewed like ancient gum. Greg handed me a piece first, the first time he'd ever done so. I didn't speak, I just nodded. The salty flavor made me think of things I hadn't remembered in days. French fries, spicy noodles, with old friends, the artificial warmth of plastic cups and neon lights, and I laughed, genuinely. The old woman didn't ask why. She just slipped another dried root into my pouch, like a grandmother pretending not to care. That night, I fell asleep with the smooth stone clutched in my hand. And for the first time, I didn't dream of the past. I dreamed of the future. A future where I, a fumbling modern traveler, would tell someone about the rainy day, about the handprints in charcoal, about the symbols no one taught me to read. A future where someone who'd never seen ancient fire might still understand. Because inside all of us, I realized, there's a part that never forgot how to sit in silence, how to draw meaning without words, and how to carry memory in the shape of a stone. We left the dense forest just as the mist was still clinging to the treetops, like the night had forgotten to exhale. The path opened up, and sunlight trickled through the canopy in warm slivers, like a hand on your shoulder that doesn't startle you, only invites you to look back and smile. Greg stopped at a bend and motioned for me to look down. Footprints, but not human, not prey, perfectly round, deep, deliberate, some sort of trap, ancient, forgotten, left by someone long gone. He tapped it, then tapped his own forehead, then mine. Pay attention, I grinned. I knew that tap now, the prehistoric version of think, idiot. A kind of Neanderthal boot camp with no drills, just deeply judgmental silence. We moved on and arrived at a clearing where the trees thinned, revealing a patch of wild grass and low shrubs. In the middle stood something unexpected, a ring of stones stacked just high enough to suggest design, not art, intention. Greg stepped into the circle and walked its edge before motioning for me to stand in the center. I hesitated at first, unsure if I was being sacrificed or knighted. But then I understood. This wasn't about seeing, it was about listening, not with ears, with skin. I stood still, closed my eyes, felt the wind weaving through my hair, the earth gently vibrating beneath my feet, like something ancient was breathing just below the surface. And, strangely, I didn't feel alone. When I opened my eyes, the rest of the group was sitting around the edge of the circle, not watching me, just being, as if waiting for me to arrive, not physically, but mentally, emotionally, spiritually, like they were giving me space to hear something I couldn't be told. Then Greg handed me a scrap of animal hide, smudged with black charcoal, a figure drawn in simple lines, one hand raised to the sky, the other on its chest. Beneath it, a spiral. I looked at him, then looked down at myself. I picked up a stick and began to draw in the dirt. Not perfect shapes, just honest ones. I drew a figure, slouched shoulders, uncertain feet, but in its hands, a fire, and around it, other symbols, hands, bows, stones, spirals. I was drawing myself among them. Greg nodded. I didn't need to be them, I only needed to be here. That afternoon, we walked again. This time, I was in the middle of the group, No one told me to stand there. It just happened. Like a puzzle piece, finally fitting. The red-haired child took my hand and didn't let go. Said nothing. Just held on like I might disappear if she blinked. We came across a herd of deer crossing the path. The group paused, not to hunt, just to watch. The deer moved like a living lullaby, their presence so quiet it echoed. They left behind no words, only the scent of grass, the warmth of hide, the thrum of something impossibly now. That night, under a dome of stars so bright it made my breath catch, Greg pulled out a pouch, leather worn, tied with sinew. He placed it in my hands. I opened it. Inside were fragments, small notched stones, bits of cracked bone, dried slivers of hide, and a tooth. I looked up at him. He spoke, quietly, in a language I still didn't understand, but my heart heard it. These were pieces of memory, bits of journey, and now they were mine. I didn't know if this was a formal rite of passage, or just Greg cleaning out his backpack. But I knew this much. From that moment forward, I wasn't just visiting. I was carrying fire, carrying wind, carrying forest, and carrying the unnamed memory of a people who once lived, once loved, once died, and somehow still lived on, in me. We entered a strange stretch of land the next morning, not because it was dangerous or breathtaking, but because it was silent in a way that didn't feel natural. No birds, no wind, no rustling leaves, just the stillness of a world holding its breath, waiting to see if we would dare to keep walking. Greg stopped at a wide scatter of rocks, rough and half-buried like a forgotten graveyard of giants. He bent down, picked up a flat stone, laid it in his palm, and let it fall gently to the ground. Like saying goodbye to an old friend, I followed, chose a stone, not the biggest, not the prettiest, just the one that felt right. I held it, placed it down, no logic, just instinct. The old woman muttered something under her breath, drawing a line in the soil with a dry twig. The red-haired child skipped around us, playing a game I couldn't see, chasing shadows I'd never be able to touch. And me, I stayed quiet. Sometimes silence is a lesson no one teaches. After we crossed the rock field, we reached a narrow valley with a stream so clear it felt like it had been filtered by time itself. Greg dipped his face in the water, then looked up with the softest smile, not amused, not ironic, just pleased. I knelt, drank. The water was so cold it pulled my heart back a beat. But when I lifted my head, the sun hit the stream just right, and I saw my reflection. But it wasn't Mimi. Not the modern face I knew. It was someone else. Mud on cheeks, faint charcoal marks on my wrist, hair wind-matted. A face I'd never drawn, but somehow had grown into. That night, we took shelter in a small cave tucked into the hillside. Greg lit the fire. I was tasked with gathering wood, and made the rookie mistake of dragging back a log the size of my ego. The old woman chuckled softly. Greg raised a brow. "You don't need big," he said. "You just need what burns." Simple words, but they echoed like poetry. You don't need big, you just need what burns. I sat by the fire, turning thin sticks in my hands, listening to the crackle like the land itself was telling stories. Every snap and pop was a memory, a life. That evening, the old woman gave me something, a cord woven from plant fibers, light and worn. On it hung small tokens, an animal tooth, a smooth stone, a wooden disc carved with a spiral. She said nothing, just placed it around my neck. It was light, but suddenly, my neck felt heavy, like I was carrying time. I lay in the cave, back against the cool stone, staring up at the uneven ceiling. The child slept beside me, curled around his stick like a teddy bear. Greg sat at the entrance, awake, watchful, as always, and something clicked in my mind. They don't walk to arrive. They walk to remember, and to make it possible for someone like me to remember again. I fell asleep to the fire's murmuring like a lullaby written in ash. And in my dream, I returned to the city. But no one recognized me, I said. I had dinner with Neanderthals. They laughed. I said, I learned to listen to stones. They shook their heads. I said, I carry their unwritten memory. They were silent. And when I reached into my pocket, the necklace was still there, light as breath, heavy as memory. We left the cave at first light, when the sun was still groggy, and the mist clung low to our ankles like friendly ghosts, reluctant to let go. No one spoke much. It was as if we all knew the journey was nearing its end. I didn't ask, when do we part ways? They didn't say, soon. But every step felt just a bit slower, a bit heavier. The kind of walk you take when you're not just moving forward, but carrying something precious you're not quite ready to put down. The red-haired child still held my hand, but loosely now, like he too had learned how to say goodbye without words. We stopped on a low hill. In the distance, I saw another land, taller grass, straight rows of trees that looked almost planned. And farther off, on the horizon, a flicker of light that didn't belong to fire or the sun. Electricity. Greg turned to me, not smiling, not sad, just timeless. He raised his hand, not to shake mine, but to touch my chest, right where my heart was. I placed my hand on his, without needing to know why. The old woman stepped forward, her arms wrapping around me like I was a fragile clay pot, cracked, but still precious. Her hands were dry and feather-light. She whispered something I couldn't understand, but my heart understood. I nodded, then turned away, not because I didn't want to look back, but because, if I did, I might never move. I walked down the hill, not fast, not slow, just walking, the way they had taught me. The ground was softer, the air different, hints of exhaust, the faint temps of asphalt, mixed with fallen leaves. I heard it again, the world I used to know, the honk of a distant car, the murmur of engines, the chatter of humans through screens, familiar and suddenly strange. I reached the edge of the forest, where pavement began. There was a road, a sign, a crushed soda can. The world I had left was there, waiting, shiny, noisy, efficient. But I didn't step onto it yet. I sat down, pulled the necklace from beneath my shirt, toothstone, carved spiral. Things no one here would understand, but I did. I reached into my pocket and took out the smooth stone the old woman had given me. I placed it gently beside the road, not as a farewell, as a seed, a memory fragment tucked quietly between two worlds. Then I stood, took a breath, and stepped into the city. No fanfare, no applause, just a person carrying fire in his heart and memory around his neck. That night, I sat in my tiny apartment, window cracked open. Above, a handful of stars fought through the city lights. I made a cup of tea. The steam curled upward, and for a second, just a second, it smelled like firewood. I closed my eyes, heard the pop of embers in my mind, heard Greg's low gravel laugh, heard the old woman's whisper like leaves falling in slow motion. And I knew The journey had ended, but the memory, it was still alive. Not in stories, but in how I looked at the world from now on, gently, deeply, and truly. If you've ever felt caught between two worlds, one hand holding your phone, the other clutching memories you haven't named yet, drop a comment and tell me, what tribes have you met in your life? And if you'd like to wander further together through strange, half-forgotten places, go ahead and follow. Who knows, next time we might be sharing tea with a drum-playing mammoth.